Basically, we really just wanted to start it. It's kind of hard. Like, so a lot of the stories we learned about this issue, like a lot of people do. So we learned about it from this global scale, and the more we researched and learned, this is about 5 years ago, the more we recognized that it was something here. And while our passion, we would love to do stuff internationally and globally one day, and we probably will eventually, we looked at our city of Richmond and we realized, and all of Central Virginia, that there was no organization that just works with trafficking victims. And so we're like, well, we want to do something about that. And so seeing like that, it wasn't just an issue we wanted to get involved in, but there's an actual need for services for victims where it wasn't, they weren't being met at that point. So we're like, well, let's do that and meet those needs. I remember the first story I read. It's funny because I actually learned about it through an organization called the Blind Project, and that they would do a lot of work in Southeast Asia. Really cool organization. So, and I found out about them through MySpace, of all random places that don't exist anymore. And so from there, I watched a video, and it was telling a story of a girl that, kind of that typical story of a girl that was taken from her home, and then forced to work in brothels and serve however many people a day. Just a lot of those horrific parts of it, and that to me kind of just wrecked my perception of the world, and I think it does that to a lot of people. And so from there, I told who at that point was my girlfriend, or I was just getting to know her, and now she's my wife, of course. But at that point, so we started to talk about it. We're like, even at that stage of our relationship, we're like, we want to do something about this, just based off that story and that fact that was happening anywhere in the world. So. Formally, we started in 2010, around the summer of 2010. It was so for a couple of years before that. It was kind of, we want to do something. We have no idea what to do. We don't feel equipped or able to do something. And I think we were just at such a personal development and growth phase individually that it was just kind of a time for us to kind of develop and figure out what our story would be and what it would really look like for us to get involved. And so from there, then it was like, okay, 2010 just kind of felt right. It was like, okay, let's do this. We were like, let's take the jump. We didn't have everything figured out. We weren't perfect on everything, but we're like, you know what, we don't want to sit around and wait anymore. We feel kind of at peace to just go for it and see how we can help and how we can get involved. Yeah, human trafficking, I guess simply is when one person or a group of people control another person for their benefit, whether that's for labor, or maybe it's debt bondage or prostitution, or you're forcing someone into sexual servitude and things like that. So it's basically taking a person and forcing them either against their will through violence, through force, through deception, through lies and stuff like that, and in turn making them work for basically free and not seeing any of that money or anything like that. Not quite, and because that's a question we get is what's the difference, do we call all prostitution trafficking? And technically we don't. I mean, and from our personal viewpoint, we view all prostitution as exploitation because it's someone exploiting vulnerability or a need or an economic need. But where we differentiate is, so if someone's like, you know what, I have an addiction, or this is just what I want to do because I can make more money, and they go out and prostitute, we don't consider that trafficking. But when there's a pimp involved, or a gang, or or a family member, or someone that introduces that concept and then is in control of that person and manages them and takes the money and stuff like that, that's when we look at it as a trafficking case. I mean, I think awareness is important, as with any cause. Not so much just so the public knows. I think that's important. I mean, honestly, of course, the public needs to know because they need to know that it's happening all over this area and all over any other area. But more so for us, where we really want to see awareness is in communities where it's taking place and where people are most at risk and vulnerable to it. And so awareness there is so key because a lot of times a victim's not going to say, oh, I'm a victim of trafficking, or hey, I'm being approached to be trafficked. They have no idea that that's this hot topic issue now, in kind of the mainstream culture. But we want to get the message and the idea out there so that they know if someone, they know maybe is going through that, or they have seen this older guy, taking this younger girl places and stuff like that, they can kind of catch on and be like, wow, something's not right there. That's not normal, that's not acceptable, and then they know where to go as a response to that information and who to call or where to take the person and stuff like that. So that's why it's important. And then also just from a basic standpoint, we want the public to know because one, they might see it, anybody's at risk. Technically, it's not just people in rough neighborhoods or just someone of another race. While there may be some key vulnerability factors, especially with gender and race sometimes, it's also can just be the middle class white suburban kid that gets caught up in this, that's seeking for love or acceptance or whatever, and that type of stuff. And that can turn into that type of situation. So just getting the word out there about that, and then also what we're doing just from a standpoint of, we need support, we need funding, we need people to spread the word about this to communities and other issues and stuff. We work with different entities. We work with other service providers, like domestic violence shelters or community organizations. We work with churches. We work with law enforcement and some other local government agencies. And so when someone's identified that, okay, this is a trafficking victim, either for labor or sex or an adult or a minor, kind of whatever type of trafficking case it is, they can contact us, and they do, and they refer that person to us. And so from that day one, our whole focus, our whole purpose of interacting with that person is to help them rebuild their life. And so for each person that looks different, it has to be really individualized, but almost every time it consists of things like medical care, housing, counseling, a lot of those basic needs, and then into things like job and life skills, help with education, help with finding a job, all those kind of things. So from that very emergency kind of phase where things are kind of crazy and hectic for them and they're just coming out of this really rough situation, to the point where we hope that they're moving on their own and reintegrating into society and able to take care of themselves. Of course, with us always there with an open door, but really walking with them through that process and looking at what are their needs, what are all the other services around, and how can we walk with them through that process and make sure that they're getting taken care of wherever they are. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that's always a hard thing to say, because it's like, well, what consists of a hub? Because there's so many different parts of the country where it's numerically so much more. I mean, Richmond isn't a huge area, but an interesting factor is the fact that we have 64 and I-95 intersecting right here, like right downtown, right off, right in the middle of the city. And so those are large transportation routes. So of course, if there's trafficking that's happening up and down the East Coast, because a lot of times pimps will take their girls from, they'll start up north and they'll come down, or they'll go, they'll just travel to different cities and to different clubs and different things like that. And some trafficking happens just here and doesn't go anywhere. But I think because of that, we have a lot of people in and out, and so it's kind of a natural occurrence to happen for it to take place here. It's not as bad as, say Atlanta or New York, but we also don't have millions and millions of people in the area. And I think Virginia's, and especially this area, is really starting to finally get a grip on, okay, what are some of the numbers, or what is this really look like here in the Richmond area? I think so. I mean, I think definitely. I mean, because we have DC up north from Richmond, we have the Virginia Beach, Tidewater area, and Eastern Shore. To the east of us, we have Richmond here, and then we even have the western part of the state where we have a lot of agriculture. I mean, we forget sometimes that there's DC, Richmond, and Virginia Beach, but then there's this whole large landmass of Virginia where things like agricultural work and stuff like that happen. So we definitely have problems with labor trafficking there, and migrant worker camps, and people being exploited there. So I'd say in Virginia, yeah, definitely we have a pretty big issue, enough that there's organizations popping up, and enough that the government statewide is really starting to pay attention and put a lot of effort into tackling the issue. Yeah, I mean, some of the things, especially with sex trafficking, one of the things people can look for is just, and honestly, I mean, I could talk about key factors, but I think the first thing you have to pay attention to is that gut feeling. If you really are just like, this doesn't look right, that guy, this girl looks really disconnected from him. If you talk to her, she really doesn't have much of an idea of where she is, or she doesn't have a purse or anything, any identification on her, or different things. If she's very withdrawn from the conversation, or different things like that, then those are some basic indicators that something might be kind of off. And time to see maybe if you can call someone, and a number that people can actually call if they know or they have information about a place or a person or something that it's happening to. They can call the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and that number is 1-888-3737-888. And that's a great national resource that Polaris Project manages from DC. I think commonly, because when people look at especially sex trafficking, some of the commonalities are maybe a younger age, so a teenager. Now, that doesn't mean that every victim of sex trafficking is a teenager and that it's only happening to young teenagers, but it definitely is. That's definitely a risky age. Because if you look at any teenager, I mean, when I was a teenager, when we were all teenagers, there was this impressionable age where we are trying to find who we are. We get caught up in all the drama, even though it's all meaningless, as we learn later on in life. But a lot of those things facilitate this need a lot of times to be loved or to be accepted. But another key factor could be something like child abuse. So if a girl or a boy has been abused as a child, then they have a high likelihood or a high vulnerability, not likelihood, but a high chance of being vulnerable to someone coming in and exploiting the fact that their perception of sex and who has ownership over their body is distorted, where they think that other people should be controlling their body, or they think that's okay for people to do that. And honestly, I think when it comes right down to it, because it is an issue that happens to boys if we're talking about sex trafficking, but a majority it's happening to girls. And so we live in not just a culture here in the U.S., but a global culture where women are typically objectified, looked at as objects, and just for that purpose of sex. And I think when that happens, that obviously is going to increase the fact that, increase the vulnerability there. And if we're talking about labor trafficking, it's a little different. It's not always the same. But labor trafficking commonly happens, for the most part, to someone from another country where either they are trying to get here through someone, and it turns into an exploitative situation where they say, you owe me this now and then you'll be free. But it's this debt that continues to accrue and it never stops accruing. Or it could even be someone that comes here, legally, they're documented, all that type of stuff, but because of maybe isolation, because of language, or even racial issues and stuff like that, they have a higher chance of being vulnerable to someone coming in and saying, oh, I can give you this, but then it's just a lie and it's just kind of it's fraudulent and stuff like that. It depends, a lot of times. Like I said earlier, a lot of times a victim's not going to self-identify because they might not recognize they're a victim. And even if they are a victim, especially when it comes to sex trafficking or labor trafficking, either one, there's something that pimps and traffickers and these people do is they instill this feeling of shame and guilt, like it's their fault, and how they should feel at fault for what they know, and that they chose to be there. And so for them, they might not think, well, I don't need to get out of it because it's my fault that I'm here. So there's nowhere I can go because, whoever outside of my circle is going to judge me for that. And so that's a tough factor for them to deal with, is feeling like outside of their situation there's nowhere they can go. And that's where that awareness does come into, where we talk about that type of control isn't healthy and that they shouldn't be subject to that. And so it really kind of depends, because at the same time, there's some people, they say, you know what, I want to get out of this. This is miserable, because they recognize that it's miserable and they want to get out of it. But it's just tough because a lot of times they don't know where they can go. But they'll go to maybe a law enforcement officer or social services or a domestic violence shelter or something like that, saying, maybe they can help me, or even a church. They'll go to a church and say, maybe someone in this church can help me. And that's why it's really good for us to have a lot of relationships and partnerships with people across a region, so that they can say, hey, I've recognized what this trafficking thing is, and this is a special thing that I need to talk to somebody about and make sure this person's getting the help they need. So I guess it does depend on the situation. I think it's definitely tough, and a lot of the times the story doesn't end well, or a lot of times someone maybe gets out of it, but then because there are no services maybe around them, they don't have the opportunity to heal from it. They just kind of go through life finding some way to cope without anyone to say, it's wrong what happened to you, and that shouldn't have happened, So it kind of depends, and it's just tough either way. It's been pretty cool seeing the past couple of years a lot has begun to happen. The ones I was really excited about are ones that are strengthening law enforcement's ability to work together and work on these cases. Because we've seen this really neat response from law enforcement that, because a lot of times people think, oh, law enforcement, they're the bad guys, they're too tough, they don't see people as victims. But the law enforcement that we've been working with really see this as a serious issue, and that it's not okay that it's happening to women, girls, men, whoever. And so they're looking at it saying, we don't just need to get the bad guys behind bars, we also need to get the person that's a victim to services and to help them rebuild their life because they recognize that's going to be a much better result for everybody. And so when I saw that when those things started to happen, that was really encouraging. And I know there's a lot of bills happening all over the country. There's a lot of legislation happening in every state, and I think it's exciting here just to see a momentum beginning to really form, and recognizing that our ideal, of course, is to have comprehensive legislation, is to have something like human trafficking not exist in our communities. But in order to get to that ideal type of society or community, it's going to take a lot of time. And it's going to take a lot of small pieces at a time to actually be sustainable. Because we don't want to just blanket change everything, and not work collaboratively with all of the different people involved. And I think that's a key piece for legislation, that it's not just NGOs like us, and it's not just law enforcement, it's not just legislators, it's not just one group of people, but it's everybody together, having some of those tough discussions about our opinions and what we think is best, but looking about how can we slowly kind of work towards a sustainable change in our communities and in our state, and ultimately in a country and the world. A lot, I guess. I think that kind of ties in what's next for the Grey Haven is really seeing this high quality approach to caring for victims of trafficking. So we're at this neat phase, and we're really grateful that we've been fortunate enough to pioneer some of the services and the care here in the Central Virginia area, and that really just encourages us, because we know that we have an opportunity with us and all the organizations we work with to really look at this from a holistic perspective and how we can address every single need that a victim has, and really focus on the individual and helping them rebuild their life. So of course, that looks like a lot of different partnerships and working with a lot of different people, but also is looking at different things, like something we're working on now is opening the first transitional housing for adult survivors of sex trafficking, and that'll be kind of a first step into providing this short-term and sometimes long-term safe place where a victim comes and they begin to rebuild their life with us, and then they transition out of it, and then to make room for more people to do that. And so that's kind of a next big step for us that we're working in, because right now we just do a lot of case management, and that's great, and we're seeing really good result with the people we're working with, but to have that safe place that's specifically for them, to where it's a home for them to really heal, and then to set them up really to move forward in a healthy and great way. And so I'd love to see more of that happening. Not just here, not just with our organization, because we know we can't do it on our own, but looking at getting to know some of the other players involved that are in maybe the western part of the state that are thinking about doing that type of stuff, or maybe in the eastern part or north or south or whatever. Just seeing how we can work together and have those conversations to make sure that the services and the care and the assistance we provide is not just reactionary and not just passionate and well-intended, but is really founded on a lot of good models and a lot of good practices that focus on the individual and make sure that we're doing a good job and doing it right. So yeah, that'd be great to see.